conversation moderated by Dr. Pablo Peña. So just to introduce them, Santiago Levy is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and senior advisor with the United Nations Development Program. Prior to that, he was vice president for sectors and knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank, general director of Mexico's Social Security Institute, deputy minister of Mexico's Ministry of Finance, and president of Mexico's Federal Competition Commission. He was president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, an associate professor of economics, and director of the Institute of Economic Development at Boston University. Prior to that, he was a visiting researcher at Cambridge University and professor of economics at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. At the Ministry of Finance, he was a main architect of Progresa Oportunidades, Mexico's incentive-based health, nutrition, and education program for the poor, promoted legal reforms to decentralize resources to state and municipalities, and participated in the change of the pay-as-you-go to the capitalized pension system. At the Social Security Institute, he promoted legal changes to reform pensions and extend coverage to rural workers. Mr. Levy's current work focuses on the interface between social policy and growth in Latin America and the challenges of socially inclusive growth. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva is UNDP's Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean since September of 2018. He has nearly 30 years of professional experience advising several Mexican governments, in addition to UNDP, and most recently, the World Bank, where he most recently served as practice manager of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. He was a co-director and lead author of the World Development Report 2017 on governance and the law. He was previously lead economist and regional poverty advisor in the bank's Europe and Central Asia region, and lead economist of the Poverty, Equity, and Gender Unit in the Latin America and the Caribbean Prem Directorate, also at the World Bank. From 2007 to 2010, he served as chief economist of Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP RBLAC in New York. Mr. Lopez Calva has been associate editor of the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, and he is fellow of the Human Development and Capabilities Association. He has also been chair of the Network on Inequality and Poverty in the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association. His research interests focus on labor markets, poverty and inequality, institutions, and microeconomics of development. He holds a master's degree in economics from Boston University, as well as a master's and doctorate in economics from Cornell University. Join me in welcoming both of our speakers. So we're going to begin with a short presentation from each of them. Can we start with Dr. Lopez Calva, please? I think he has a presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Sofia, and thank you to all the audience. So I prepared a presentation, but I realized that this is a bit more informal. I will present a few slides, but not the whole presentation, because I understand the idea is that we have a more informal conversation. And I also know that this is the last session and the drinks are waiting and you are ready to go for that. So let me briefly share my presentation. There were three main points in my presentation, and again, I will summarize. One was that first message is that since a few years ago, mainly after the COVID crisis, we realized that we are facing a world with increased uncertainty. And I want to show you three drivers of that uncertainty. That way we say the future is not what it used to be. And I would say that three identifiable sources of uncertainty, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic that completely, that impacted heavily, systemically. And then when we were just recovering from that, the conflict in Europe, the Ukraine crisis, and as a more structural long-term aspect, all the impact of climate change. So these are just few recognizable aspects of what I think are drivers of increased uncertainty. And so it's something that, talking about innovation, which is what we were asked to talk policy from a policy perspective, I would say that one of the main questions we have is how to manage this increased uncertainty. So I had some data on this, but it's data that that Latin America was heavily impacted by the COVID crisis. The recent revisions on growth that show that there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the recovery, increasing prices of energy and food. You can see here, this is by year, the colors show different years, and the red one is the current year in terms of the FAO food price index. So we are, by the way, we were in March at the highest level of this FAO index in 60 years. So there is a huge inflation in the price of food. So if we think about the impact in Latin America and the Caribbean, this matrix, what it shows is that you have to think first. It's not, of course, the ending point, it's just the starting point. Which countries are net energy exporters or net energy importers, and which ones are net exporters of food, and which ones are net importers of agricultural goods. And then you can then group the countries, and from there you start looking at what could be the potential impact. As you can see, the majority of the countries in the region are actually net importers of both. In some cases, you have countries that are net importers of agricultural products, but they export energy. And then this really tells you a little bit of a first taxonomy of which countries could be most affected. We have seen rising inflation. But I want to go to one point that I want to make as the main message of this conversation. And this is, think of the process through which we generate long-term development. And the idea is that you have a stock of assets as a society that are human, physical, financial, social, and natural. So you have stock. And basically, as we saw, for example, the COVID crisis was a huge impact on our stock of human capital, and it will definitely have lasting effects through the educational system and so on, and through the health crisis. It was a destruction of human capital, which is something we're not used to seeing. And for example, the issue of climate change that is very much related to how we deal with natural capital. But in general, you think of these assets, and we as a society transform those assets, which are stocks, into flows. And basically, normally we measure how we are doing in terms of flows, in terms of GDP, in terms of consumption, in terms of household income. So in general, prosperity has been measured in terms of these flows traditionally. And there is, in a way, a new conversation that tries to bring us back to the idea of a more comprehensive notion of progress, in which we also take, look into what is happening to the stocks. So that's why, at the UN, the famous 5 Ps, but these are 3 of them: prosperity, people, planet. So the idea is how we make all these compatible by not only looking at the flows, but also to the stocks. And this relates to one concept, which we call resilience. So resilience, and as you see recently, the fund and the IMF are creating this new facility that actually has in its name resilience. So resilience, in a very simple way, if you look at you have a trajectory of a certain variable and there is a shock, then you recover. There are different ways in which you recover. There is one very simple measure of resilience, which is the time it takes for you to go back to your previous path. So it could be short or it could be longer, right? So in this case, if we have these 2 different types of recovery, we say that A is more resilient than B. Very simple. The time it takes to go back to your previous path. Now let's bring back to the conversation on assets and stock, sorry, stocks and flows. What we're basically asked to do now is to go back to our previous path in terms of GDP, I just mentioned growth, in terms of consumption, but at the same time, we're asked to protect the stock, right? So in a way, what we're trying to push countries to do is to be resilient, but at the same time, in the sense of going back to a previous path, but at the same time, changing this transformation function, the technology through which you deal with, for example, natural assets and you turn them into flows. So my main point, and with this I close for opening the conversation, is that this is a major challenge in our thinking for us as development economists and practitioners, that we're asked to do, come up with answers to. First, in a world of increased uncertainty, we have to think about how to be resilient, how to quickly go back to levels of welfare that were affected by all these overlapping crises, but at the same time, taking care of what is happening to the stocks, mainly, particularly, but not only, natural assets. So I insist what this means is we're forced to think about ways to innovate and change this transformation function from assets to flows. I had more to present, but I will leave it there because I think this is perhaps a good point to motivate the conversation about innovation in policy in this current context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez Calva. You can see the audience, but they're all really excited and happy for your conversation. Now, we're gonna head into a conversation with Dr. Levy. So I give you the word. Can you hear
Thank
us?
you.
Perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well because I'm outside of the house. But in any case, I want to begin by thanking Sophia for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be with the students at University of Chicago and to share the conversation with Luis Felipe Lopez Calva. So let me just make some remarks. I didn't prepare any slides, but let me just make some remarks in two parts. The first part is, think of Latin America before COVID. So think where we were about 2.5, 3 years ago. And UNDP, actually under the leadership of Luis Felipe, published a report last year in which what it was clearly shown is that even before COVID, Latin America was one of the worst performing regions of the world. It was one of the most unequal regions of the world, and it was at the same time one of the slowest growing regions of the world. So we had a lot of challenges, a lot of troubles, even before COVID. If you dig a little bit deeper into trying to understand why is it that Latin America does not grow as much as it should, and in fact has been one of the slowest growing regions of the world, what you find is that for most countries of the region, there's been very little, sometimes negative productivity growth over the last 3 decades. That's a pretty strong statement. It says that Latin American societies over a long period have not been able to increase the efficiency with they produce and the way they're organized to be more productive. Clearly, innovation is one dimension of this, and not only innovation in the traditional sense of adopting technologies or creating new technologies, but also in terms of innovating public policies. And what this tells us is that the public policies that have been in place, at least in some dimensions, have not been the appropriate ones. And in fact, even before COVID, the region was in need of a lot of rethink of its development strategy to be able to create conditions so that productivity growth could grow, and at the same time, to design social policies to make the region less unequal. And there, you at the University of Chicago and other people that are beginning your careers have a great room to go. There's a big challenge out there. There's a lot of contributions that need to be done, because clearly the standard policy prescriptions that we have followed over the last 3 decades, while they worked in some dimensions, They did deliver macroeconomic stability, and they did deliver lower inflation. They did not bring a shared prosperity, and they did not bring a region of the world that could compete with other regions of the world in East Asia or in Eastern Europe or other parts of the world. All those challenges were there before COVID. What COVID has done, and more recently Ukraine has done, it has made this situation even more challenging than it was before. As we know, the public health response in Latin America to COVID was complex, and the main reason is that we have, in most countries, segmented health systems. And segmented health systems had a lot of difficulty in dealing with a pandemic. In addition, our social protection systems were also segmented, so we did not have the means to compensate many of the households, particularly in the informal sector, that needed to be compensated and be helped during the pandemic. We also did not have the means to make sure that people who were losing education could make up the education, and there's some estimates that the region might have lost a year and a half worth of education as a result of the pandemic. And lastly, the pandemic actually worsened something in which Latin America was doing well before COVID, but now it's not doing so well. If you look at the macro indicators of Latin America, particularly inflation and debt, Latin America, with some exceptions, by and large was a region that was doing well. The debt to GDP ratios were not so high. However, 3 years after COVID, in most countries, the debt to GDP ratios have now increased, and the macroeconomic scenario, which was not a challenge before COVID, is beginning to be a challenge, worsened by some of the reasons that Luis Felipe mentioned, particularly the Ukraine crisis. If you add a context in which world inflation is going up, food prices are going up in particular, and energy prices are going up, and in addition, very importantly, monetary conditions in the international capital markets are changing. The Federal Reserve Bank is tightening monetary policy. The European Bank is tightening monetary policy. What you see is that Latin America is now in a more fragile position than it was before, because now it has higher debt than it had before COVID, but now has to face this debt with higher interest rates and in a context in which there's importing a lot of inflation from energy and food prices. In this environment, the sort of resilience that Luis Felipe was discussing about, which is fundamental, takes a double importance. Many countries in Latin America have yet to recover the income per capita levels that we had before COVID, and certainly the consumption levels, particularly in lower households in the lower part of the income distribution. And now the context that is being created by the Ukraine crisis has actually made the challenge bigger. So I want to stop here by saying we need innovation, but we need innovation in more dimensions than what is usually thought, not only in terms of how businesses is done and how they incorporate technologies and how we do digital transformations. We also need innovation in our thinking about development. We need innovation in the way we think about public policy and to bring new solutions to make the region more prosperous and less unequal than has been in the past. So these are kind of some opening remarks, and I stop here again, thanking Sophia and all of you for listening to me. You conduct the conversation from this point on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Levy. I'm gonna take a step back for a second. I was very excited when we started the panel and I think I didn't introduce the topic and everything else properly. So the topic of the panel was innovation opportunities for development in Latin America. And just a brief overview, what we would like is to highlight that we must create spaces to advance inclusive and innovative solutions to tackle the issues concerning labor market inclusion, poverty alleviation, inequality, as well as economic growth and productivity. So that's why we had these amazing experts with us today. To continue with the moderation of conversation, we have Dr. Pablo Peña who's joining us. He's an economist with a PhD at UChicago with a passion for applied price theory, human capital theory, and empirical economics. He has taught at the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics at U Chicago since 2019, when he joined as assistant instructional professor. He's the director of private sector partnerships at the Development Innovation Lab, which focuses on finding and promoting interventions that raise the living standards of vulnerable communities. In 2013, he co-founded Microanalytica, a consulting firm that uses experiments and quasi-experiments to produce actionable intelligence for businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies. He led the Economic Studies Group at Mexico's National Banking and Securities Commission. He also worked on antitrust legal conflicts at the Chicago-based consulting firm and analyzed tax policy, insurance, pensions, and development banking at Mexico's Ministry of Finance. The common thread in his professional life has been the use of large data sets to test economic theories of behavior and produce insights of practical value. Join me in introducing Dr. Pablo Peña.
Thank you, Sofia. It's a pleasure to be here and with such great guests. It's easy. My job is super easy. I just have to float a couple of ideas to them, and I would like to hear the reactions. And I think after that, we can open the floor for questions. So if that's all right, we can proceed. Thank you, Santiago and Luis Felipe. That was great. Those are great thought-provoking slides and ideas. I would like to start with two questions and hear your reactions. The first one is about the long run. One of the things that surprised me when the pandemic started was that I only saw two studies regarding the 1918 influenza pandemic. Like, economists really didn't look at that. Most people don't even know what was the effect on the economy. It was studied a little bit, particularly people in demography. So the question that started bothering me was, is it the case that the grandchildren of the students in this room are really not gonna know anything about this pandemic the way we don't know anything about the 1918 pandemic? Because at the moment was big, but it turned out that countries, societies were resilient, and that coincided with World War I. But so is it a little bit an overreaction from an intellectual perspective? We're just looking at the flavor of the month, or is it going to be a big issue that stays here for a long time? That's one point, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that. The second one is about policy versus politics. We seem to be, as a country, and I'm sorry, as an international community, but particular countries, heading in the right direction in terms of adopting frameworks to evaluate policies, scale what seems to work. Not always, it wasn't always easy, but at least we had a blueprint of how to test what works. And it seems that policy aspect has been toned down quite a bit because politics has been guiding policy more and more. So we have examples of populist governments striking down programs, erasing policies, and just instituting something that looks like unproven technologies or policies that remind us of what was done in the past without proper impact evaluation. So to summarize the 2 points that I want to float to get your reactions and your thoughts on that. The first one is the long run perspective. Are we going to look back at this pandemic in 50 years and not even recall it like it happened with the 1918? I would argue, perhaps I'm wrong. The other is policy versus politics. Are we now perhaps worse than we were 20 years ago when there was some consensus that policies were supposed to be measured, and then if they were proven effective, scaled? And we seem to have evidence that some politicians push for unproven solutions to poverty problems, health issues, and so on. So I want to stop here. I want to hear your reactions and thoughts, and then perhaps after that, students who want to continue the conversation can come up to the podium or go to the microphone in the back and ask your questions. Thank you. Whomever wants to start.
Santiago, you want me to
Uh,
start?
yeah, why don't you go ahead, Luis Felipe?
Okay, because this is a broad topic, so just a few thoughts because it's a complex a question, and thank you for the conversation. I would first say that the two questions are I think in my view they are related, and let me give you one example. If we look at what Ben Bernanke, the way he approached the financial crisis of 2010, 2009, if you, I mean, at least if you read his book and so on, and we saw it, it was by what we learned from the Great Depression. And he was an expert in understanding the mechanics of crisis, of financial crisis. And from all that knowledge that has been accumulated, I think the management of that global crisis was, I could argue, better, much better than it could have been without all that knowledge. So in a way, these two things coincided. I think one thing that we learned, first, I would say that this crisis has generated, the COVID crisis, a lot of data. And I think I'm sure that there is a lot of analysis being done as we speak in terms of what is the impact in different aspects. We have with a couple of co-authors, Luis Angel Monroy Gomez Franco and Roberto Vélez, we have written on the educational impact, for example, intergenerational impact of the crisis. There is a lot written on the education side. On the health, for example, we saw the speed at which vaccines were developed, which is, of course, unprecedented if we compare to other cases like this, I mean, or to other vaccines that took a long time. And I think the value of science and knowledge, I think when the crisis emerges, I'm talking about the financial one, the COVID crisis, I think if there is one lesson we can draw from it, is that the accumulated knowledge is really important to respond to that crisis. So in that sense, first, I think a lot of analysis, I'm sure, is being done. Hopefully, we will have it available whenever, hopefully it's going to take a long time, but whenever there is another crisis. But I would argue that this knowledge is fundamental for us to be resilient collectively to learn from that. So your question, I think, is very valid, very relevant, but I would say that there is a lot of analysis being done because there's a lot of data generated and so on. But the other point is about the politics and policy. One thing is that we can generate and we learn that actually that knowledge is useful to respond. And the other thing is how the political dynamics have been driven in a direction in which, as you said, the value of evidence in policymaking has been definitely being reduced, has been weakened in many contexts. And we see, as you said, we see unfortunately dynamics in which facts and data and evidence are not as valued in certain political contexts for decision making. I think we have come from 20, 30 years in which we positioned in many aspects how evidence-based policymaking was the way to go. It's true, it's not always of the best quality, and somebody could argue that there was also a little bit of policy-based evidence-making, as somebody said. But I think if you do it right, I think this is very important. And we have to continue from places like UNDP, from the World Bank, from international organizations, from academia, places like University of Chicago and Harris School of Public Affairs in general. We need to continue making the case for the importance of evidence in decision making, because I think in the long term that's what really leads to better policies. So we should insist on that. And just one final point: if we read from history, for example, Frank Fukuyama's Origins of Political Order, one fundamental aspect to protect this professionalism in decision-making and politics is civil service reform. Countries that underwent that, when you have public servants that actually are vulnerable to political change and they depend on the leader to be in their positions, I think that becomes all the value of knowledge is diluted. I think if you tell me one thing in terms of how to link the politics, how to bring the politics of evidence-based policymaking to a more stable foundation, I would say we should be pushing everywhere for civil service reform, because when you have stability and good technical teams in government, then the political fluctuations are less negative for that kind of trend. But anyway, I spoke too long, so thank you.
I guess I'll jump in, Pablo, and thank you for your two questions. Let me tackle the first. It depends a little bit what you mean by long run. If you have the long run in mind, a century, because the Spanish flu was a century ago, and we say, well, a century later, we don't think about much of the Spanish flu. In a century from today, we'll be thinking a lot about COVID. If that's our definition of the long run, I think you're probably right. And probably in a century from today, COVID is not going to be much part of the discussion. If you think about the long run, a little bit short, maybe 2-3 decades, perhaps up to 4 decades, the answer is more nuanced. In my previous intervention, I said that even before COVID, Latin America had been doing relatively mediocre for the last 3 centuries. If you add on the debt crisis of the 1980s, you now have a continent that for 4 decades has really been a mediocre region of the world. So COVID might be a blip, but it might be a distraction in the sense that it is not because of COVID that we're not doing well. We were not doing well before COVID. And COVID might worsen things a bit. Whether it will make a big difference over the next decade or not, it will depend a lot on the policy reaction. Hopefully, we did learn from the 1980s that if we lose control of the macroeconomic situation, then a short-run crisis can turn into a 15-year crisis that can be extremely costly. So hopefully, we can recover, and I'm speaking about the next months of 2022 and beginning months of 2023, if we can strengthen macroeconomic stability. It is not that we will be running ahead, it is just that we will have avoided COVID and perhaps the Ukraine crisis to derail the macro, and we will be back facing the same challenges that we were facing before COVID, which were huge, and which, as I mentioned before, needed some kind of innovation in thinking to tackle them. So that's kind of my reaction to your first question, Pablo. On your second point, I would say this. Yes, it is true that over the last perhaps 2 decades, the use of microeconomic evidence for policy purposes substantially increased the design of individual programs. So we can now do microeconomic analysis, very careful treatment control, do regression discontinuity, or do whatever econometric method you guys have learned at Chicago. And we can, yes, say whether this particular education program improves educational outcomes, and whether this health program improves health outcomes, or this poverty program improves school attendance, whatever. There's a huge literature that you guys all went through that. I am not so sure, Pablo. I am not so sure that even though we have a lot much better understanding of individual programs, policy making improved from the point of view of having a coherent set of policies, not one single individual policy, but a coherent set of policies. And I want to go back to the UNDP report from 2021. If you look at the 2021 report from UNDP, what you see is Latin America is a region of the world in which there was a lot of innovation in non-contributory pensions, and in CCTs for poverty alleviation, and maybe non-contributory programs, and maybe this education program. But Latin America also kept the aggregate social policy architecture that it had before. And part of what the UNDP report argues is that the overall architecture is by and large incoherent. So that improvements in individual policy making, when we look at isolated programs, did not necessarily translate into better policy making when you think about the systemic framework in which social policies were being implemented. So it is true, though, that lately disenchantment with that kind of approach is leading to probably which is the worst outcome, which is to discard microeconomic analysis and then to just sort of go to, let me just see what is the latest fad and try to put that on. So unfortunately, we're not taking the right lesson from this, which is we need to complement individual analysis of policies with systemic evaluation of strategies and not individual programs. And this, Pablo, is something that the region has not done. Politics will always be there in policy making. It's very difficult to think of policy in a vacuum. Policies are always implemented in particular societies in a particular context. The question is whether these policies can go in the right direction or not. And there, yes, you're right. Lately, there's a lot more kind of guessing and a lot less using of systemic empirical evidence. And that is very sad, but it's no guarantee that using systemic empirical evidence by itself will generate coherent development strategies as opposed to isolated programs. So let me stop there.
All right, thank you very much. I think now we open the floor for questions. So if you want to go back to that microphone, or you can come here to the podium. Okay. You like the spotlight? All right.
He wants to pretend to be president. Yeah, I want to pretend to be president for a while. No, I just want to follow on the idea of Professor Levy and challenge the idea of politics versus policy, because we have seen for a long time policymakers making the claim of how we make politicians to listen to us and to follow what we as intellectuals or as academics can make them, or what we already proved that they should make. But shouldn't we look at the academia on how, or as a policymakers, on how we introduce the political reality into our models? I mean, how we see the political implications of the measure of the policies that we propose and the incentive of the politicians and of the stakeholders in the country, and how we introduce that into our models to create or to propose policy reforms.
Luis, you want to go first or you want me to go first? I mean, it's up to you.
No, go first.
So thank you for your question. I didn't quite get your name, but thank you for your question. So my view on what you're saying is, I think what we think of the problem as kind of step by step. In the first step, if you're analyzing an individual issue, you really just want to understand what the issue is. You want to gather empirical evidence. You want to do some econometric testing. You want to think about the incentives of the various people involved in that particular policy, and to try to think sort of in this particular policy, what is the best way in which it should be tackled? Now, clearly, your question says that's not enough. And I agree, that's not enough. And so then I would think of sequentially a second step in which you say, all right, I think this is a policy that in principle would work and would be useful. Let me now rethink of this policy in the particular context of Peru in 2022, or Brazil, or Mexico? And there your answer might be a little bit different because you take into account other issues that did not take into account before, like administrative capabilities, political context, and then coming up with the right policy needs to also consider these things without losing sight of the first step. What you don't want to do is say, look, because of administrative capabilities and the political context, then I will implement a policy that makes no sense. You might want to say, look, even though I'd like to implement this policy on first best principles, taking into account political context, it might not be done 100%, but at least in the right direction, I will begin to move and push in the right direction. So to finish up, I would tackle your questions sequentially. I will always try to get the question, the right answer. And then secondly, equally important, but secondly, think about the particular political context and how the policy is modified before you actually come to implementation. I don't know what, probably Luis has better thoughts on me.
Thank you, Santiago. No, very consistent. And thanks for the question. I think it's a very important question. Your question actually gives me an opportunity to invite you to read the World Development Report 2017 on governance and the law, because we actually address some of the macro foundations of how power is exercised in the policy design. And in a way, we say that in the same way in which Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, that you may know very well in Chicago, have the question of why nations fail, our report looks at why policies fail. And then I think it could be helpful. But in any case, that was a commercial. But very consistent with what Santiago said, let me tell you a metaphor that I used from President Obama when he was asked in an interview which sports was more similar to politics. And he said American football, because you need a very solid strategy, but the way sometimes you move very slowly. So sometimes a lot of hitting, a lot of, sometimes going back, but from time to time you find a space and you go a long way, But the important thing here in that analogy that President Obama mentioned is that you know very clearly where you want to go. And this is where the evidence and the thinking tells you where to go. What matters is the direction of change. And yes, sometimes you're not going to be able to go at the speed at which you would like to go. But I think what you shouldn't do, as Santiago said at the end, and I reiterate that, you don't want to do is because you cannot move forward, you then turn around and go in the other direction, because then it could be literally self-defeating. So you really have to, I think, think in those terms. You understand that political implications and politics are very complex, but again, you need to have a clear direction, and that is what knowledge, evidence, and thinking is going to inform. I would leave it there. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah. We have another person there. So yeah, just please state your name.
Hello, my name is Omar Seguel. I am from Chile. Thank you very much for your words. They are very illustrative. My question is related. We are entering through a period of polarization in the region. Many governments are changing, and also this political situation is polarizing. Also, we are starting a period of extra-inflation, a lot of inflation with low growth. We see that job markets are debilitating, weakening. So there is a need for a boost in the economy, but we are trapped, right? I wanted to ask, and Mr. Levy talk about the strategic view of policies and how they harmonize. I can imagine that that is easy to think in a country level, but what is the role of the international cooperation in a regional level to harmonize strategic economic goals, and how can we promote the development of the region thinking strategically in policies and harmonize between countries? I will highlight the experience of the Alianza del Pacífico with Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. That was an economic experience, not political experience, that was very successful so far. So if you could share some words on that as well. Thank you.
Um, so thank you for your question, and it's very relevant. And both for Luis Felipe and myself, we both have worked for international organizations, and maybe Luis Felipe will have some thoughts also on this question. I would say there are at least two roles for international organizations, not only in the current context of Latin America, given the circumstances you rightly described, but in general, there are two roles for organizations. One is to play the role of the honest broker. Sometimes governments are divided, cabinets are divided. This minister wants A, this other minister wants B, a third minister wants C. Sometimes it's because they have different political interests. Sometimes it's because they have legitimate differences of opinion. And sometimes governments have difficulty charting the right policy. So international organizations may be useful if they play the role of the honest broker. If they participate in the policy debate in the country, they bring in the best evidence. They don't take sides for this minister or that minister. They really are a little bit outside of the short-run politics, and they try to provide the best advice possible. And right now, international organizations like the IMF, the IDB, the World Bank, UNDP, the Economic Commission for Latin America could be very useful to Latin America by saying, look, there is this crisis, Ukraine, food crisis, energy crisis, what Luis Felipe described at the beginning, and we understand the complexities of your politics, but this is what we think you should be doing. So role number one is honest broker. Role number two is, in some cases, they can also provide financing to smooth cycles. And in contexts in which access to international finance is not so easy for all countries, or international capital markets become closed because there's a lot of uncertainty, for countries in Latin America to be able to go to the IMF, to go to the World Bank, or to go to the IDB, or to the CAF and access loans in better conditions is also a very useful role. And these two roles are complementary. And so there's potentially, if the international organizations do their job right, and they don't always do it right, but if they do it right, there is some work, some help that can be coming from this organization for the region. And in this complex moment, that would actually be very welcome. I stop here.
Very, very clear agreement, Santiago. So very briefly, just to say that through those instruments, this role of supporting agreements among local actors to go in the right direction, you have different instruments. You have these, for example, financial instruments, the idea of bringing the best knowledge that you can get from some other places, and the idea also to make information and evidence available to all the actors so they can reach agreement by having the same information, the same facts. I think that is the honest broker role that Santiago is imagining. So in a way, you are helping actors that in other conditions wouldn't have access to certain information to have it and be part of the conversation. So in that sense, you support policies that can be more sustainable and more linked to evidence that they work. So that is one role, but the other one related to what Santiago said, but saying it more explicitly, is also to help with policies that require coordination across countries. There are certain policies that require countries to be coordinated in a response. And I think international multilateral organizations should be playing even more proactively that role of policy coordination, which goes at the supranational level, because many of the challenges we're facing today go beyond the realm of nation states, and then you have to get agreements among states. And I think that is the other role that we can play, and that could be extremely helpful for the solution to the many problems that are either regional or global. I would leave it there.
Excellent. We have another question here. Don't forget to state your name.
Hello both. Thank you so much for your remarks. My name is Ernesto Truqui. I'm a Mexican master's student here at Harris, And my question to you, to bring it back to the subject of the discussion, which is innovation, Dr. Lopez Calva, you mentioned earlier this idea of, rather than evidence-based policy, policy-based evidence, which is a sort of innovative idea people like John List have been pushing for in his new book. And it seems to me, reading the climate, when hearing people like you speak, microeconomists, that experimental economics is good, and innovation is good, and learning what works is good. But then, Dr. Levy, you mentioned that, yes, we might understand causal effects of a lot of different programs a lot better now, but they aren't put into a coherent strategy that makes sense and that takes advantage of all these effects that we're being able to measure. Do you both have any thoughts as to how we can marry these two, experimentation, innovation, figure out how stuff works and whether new stuff works, but putting this all, fitting it all together? Thank you.
Luis, why don't you go first now?
Thank you, Santiago, and thank you for the question. It is a tough question. I think in a way it's related to what it's treated in a lot of the literature about the scaling up of interventions that are tested in a very controlled environment. So I would say that what we have learned in the last decades about experimental evidence and quasi-experimental analysis and so on is super important methodologically to learn about specific mechanisms and processes of how these certain policies can have effects and then inform the policy design. But I think it's very important what Santiago said at the beginning. You cannot experiment with systemic changes. You can experiment with particular interventions, and you can test particular interventions. And then you need what Kaushik Basu calls reasoned intuition. You need to think about the systemic issues in a way that requires a discussion, a lot of quality discussion, thinking, and a political process that leads you in the direction of these systemic change. And I think that is the challenge: how you bring different elements of interventions that that work into a strategy, into a systemic change in which you cannot experiment. And I think that is the role of the quality of the political process, the quality of the public deliberation, the quality of the controls, the strength of the controls on power, so you can correct. And that is only, I think, in a way, it's a gradual process. But again, as I said in my previous intervention, the key issue here is that you go in the right direction, even when certain aspects don't work. The problems are more serious when, as Santiago has pointed out in his work, when actually you are not going in the right direction. Then the systemic change that you need is much deeper. But I'll give the floor to Santiago.
No, I very much agree with Luis Felipe, and thank you for the question. I mean, the issue that you bring up is a very, very difficult issue, and it's insufficiently recognized, I believe, and so I'm happy you bring it up. I think that we have to continue along the lines of doing experimental economics. We learn a lot. We have to continue gathering evidence. We have to continue doing careful econometric evaluation. But we also have to be much more aware than we have been in the last 2 decades that that is not enough. And that identifying causality in a single policy and then knowing, look, this program increased this outcome by 1 standard deviation or whatever metric you want. Therefore, let's implement it and scale it up. That is a non sequitur. And that before you actually go to scale up programs and to implement programs, aside from knowing the details of the microeconomics of that individual program, you have to ask broader questions about, well, how will this program interact with other programs? And how does this program interact in the particular institutional context of this country? And what do I expect to be the reaction or the behavior of whatever agents there are, students, workers, firms, entrepreneurs, whomever, to the complex set of incentives that will be created by this new program interacting with the previous programs. My reading of what has happened in Latin America over the last 2.5 decades is that we did not ask these questions sufficiently. We were very attracted to the microeconomics of impact evaluations. We were obsessed with identifying everything to the third digit and making sure that the standard errors were right and that the econometric technique was right. And that's all fine and dandy, and we should do that. But then we jumped from there to say, therefore, this is what should be done by this country. And that, therefore, in many occasions was wrong. And we now need to develop models, which are difficult to do, that can be a combination of what Luis Felipe said, Kaushik mentioned, informed intuition, to try to come up with the general equilibrium of the system and to try to think about the interactions. And this is, I think, a big methodological challenge from the academic point of view and a huge challenge from the policy point of view. And looking forward, and if this is a panel innovation, this is something on which we need to innovate. And we need to think differently from the way that we have thought differently before. So this doesn't mean that all the econometrics and all the impact evaluation techniques that you guys learned at Chicago are not useful. They're very useful. It just says it is not enough. And that's only about half of the work. Let me stop here.
Well, thank you for your answers and your comments. Very illuminating. So we're going to stop here with the questions. And before we close, I just wanted to remind you that over the week we had several events as part of the inauguration of the Development Innovation Lab. The new lab here at the University of Chicago, led by Michael Kremer, Professor and Nobel laureate here at the Econ Department and the Harris School of Public Policy. So what we aim to do at the lab is to, excuse me for reading, I read because I don't want to get it wrong. But I know what we do, but I think we use the tools of economics to identify, test, refine, and scale innovations with the potential to benefit millions of people in low and middle income countries. To do that, we bring together researchers of various fields together with governments, firms, and not-for-profits. So I invite you to check us out, see what we do, and we're part of a community here at the university that works on development issues. So if you're interested, check out all the different initiatives at the BFI, the Becker Friedman Institute. I think you're gonna find something that you might be interested in. So thank you, Santiago. Thank you, Luis Felipe. I'm gonna give the microphone to Sofia, and it was a pleasure to be here, guys.
Thank you, Pablo.
Hi, thank you all very much for your insights. We are extremely grateful for your time, especially on a Saturday afternoon. We know that these are very valuable. Personally, I admire both of you deeply, and I must say that I'm a fan of Dr. Lopez Calva's Graph for Thought, and I highly recommend it. And Santiago, I think you know by now that I could hear you talk about these issues for hours. We hope that you have a nice rest of your day. Thank you for being here, and I hope that we can meet in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye,
Luis
Santiago.
Felipe. Thank you. Bye, guys. Enjoy
Bye,
your drinks.
thank
Enjoy your drinks.
Enjoy your drinks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
you. Salud. Gracias. Gracias.